and 10 years from now somebody got out of school and their combined interest rate was 9%, we give them the option of going back to 8.25. And I think the senator from West Virginia made an extremely good point. For the most subsidized student, they can only borrow $3,500 that's subsidized.
Is that wrong?
So you think of the institutions that are out there, none of them have an annual tuition of $3,500. We know that they're going to borrow out of the 6.8% pot. What we're offering is that the pots are the same, and that the subsidy is that for students that qualify for the subsidy, they're not responsible for the interest rate while they're in school. That subsidy still exists. It's just we're not overcharging one group, and we're certainly not overcharging the ones we just subsidized because they've got to borrow more money to complete their college education.
My friends, let me just say that I graduate now, no matter what the interest rates are, no matter what they might have been. I graduate, and economic times are tough. I find a job. It's not what I think my value is, but I find a job at $40,000. And $40,000, I'm married now and I have a child or two. Don't we have in our bill a protection which has been in place for a long time? Both Democrats and Republicans have supported this protection, which is called income-based repayment. I'm only, by law, I can only pay 15% of my disposable income, and I think that breaks down to my payment can only be $142. $142, and so isn't that a subsidy too? Or wouldn't we be subsidizing that to a certain extent? And I'm also understanding if my economic condition doesn't improve, and that's all I pay, by the end of 25 years, it's exonerated. I pay nothing. I'm done.
If I could respond to the senator, the answer is yes to that. Not only is there, and I think it's fair to say that the consolidation option that a student has in case the rates go up at 8.25% can be called a cap. Not a hard cap, but it's a cap. And a second cap is this income repayment provision that you speak of. If you're making $40,000 a year, after they apply the formula, you probably aren't spending more than about 10% of your income. It's something called disposable income that you can be required to pay on your student loan, and that continues for about 20 years. And if at the end of 20 years you haven't paid it off, the loan is forgiven. So any student who has a loan has that opportunity. They can consolidate at 8.25%, and income repayment limits the amount they have to pay each year. So they have that. And then one of the things I noticed about the Manchin-Burr bill that I'd like to ask the senators to talk about a little bit is that you've come up with a really, what I'm beginning to understand as I study this more and more, is a very significant contribution. The idea that all of the undergraduate student loans, which as I understand it are about 2 out of 3 of the loans, ought to have the same interest rate. It's confusing the way it is now. But the other reason is about 80% of the people who have subsidized loans, low-income students, also have unsubsidized loans.
As if in morning business for such time.
The Senate's in a quorum.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ask unanimous consent that I be recognized as if in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection, so ordered.
All right, Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, the President gave a beautiful speech on global warming. He said that the world is coming to an end, and if we don't act, it's our moral obligation to make sure our planet is saved for future generations, and that it's all up to us. And to be successful, we must regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. For more than a decade, environmentalists have been pressuring Democrats to do this and have been pressuring all of us to do this, and we all know why. I can remember years ago, and this would have been back when I was in the House, my first observation was that when I looked at liberals in the House, I said there are 4 flawed premises on which they base their decisions. One was, and I'm going from memory now, this is many years ago, one was that the Cold War's over, we no longer need a defense. Another one was that deficit spending is not bad public policy. A third one, punishment's not a deterrent to crime. And the fourth one, and this is the big one, is that government can run our lives better than people can. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. The reason they've been wanting to do this with regulating carbon, I think is better articulated by a guy that I don't think anyone will argue could be the most knowledgeable scientist in America. His name is Richard Lindzen with MIT. And he said, and his quote was that regulating carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you regulate carbon, you regulate life. You control life. And that's what bureaucrats want to do. And that's what the environmentalists want to do in controlling our lives. They want to determine what cars we drive, what kind of houses we live in, how our cities are built, and all of that. And they can do all of this by regulating carbon dioxide. And but Democrats, particularly in the Senate, have been unsuccessful in passing legislation to accomplish this. This is the key. It was way back during the Kyoto Convention, and that was during the Clinton administration, when Al Gore came back and he said, well, we need to pass and ratify the Kyoto Convention. The Kyoto Convention would do exactly that. It would allow us in this country and around the world to regulate carbon emissions. Now, if they do this, they're able to control the lives. This was way back 13 years ago that this was taking place. So anyway, they started trying to pass legislation. The first one actually was not necessarily a Democrat bill. It was McCain-Lieberman, and it was one that was a cap-and-trade bill. And quite frankly, at that time, the Republicans were a majority, and I chaired the committee called Environment and Public Works. And so I was on the floor managing the opposition to that particular cap-and-trade bill. That was a carbon control bill. And we won. And the years went by, and we continued to win over and over again. So I guess what I'm saying is the reason the President's doing this right now is because he can't get it done by anyone who's accountable to the people. He can't get it done through legislation, so he's trying to do it through regulation. So, and the most recent one was 2009, the Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill. And by the way, I congratulate Senator Markey for winning that election. It's going to be fun for us because we've debated each other on this issue now for years and years. Now we're in the same chamber. But the bottom line was, in 2009, they did pass that in the Democrat-controlled House, and it came over, and of course it was not even considered in the Senate. So it would have regulated only the largest emitters. This is the hardest thing to get across to people, because everyone understands after 12 years of repetition and listening to me at this podium say it over and over again, that if we were to pass any kind of a cap and trade, the cost to the American people would be somewhere between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, the reason I say that, the Wharton School came out and they came up with a figure around $350 billion. MIT came out with a figure about the same. So no one debated that for 10 years. The cost of regulating through cap and trade would have been somewhere around $300 to $400 billion. Now, as onerous as I think all these bills were trying to do this by legislation, it wouldn't have been nearly as bad as what's happening today for this reason. It gets into the weeds here, but it's important that we in this body understand what this is all about. Because the bills that we killed that would have cost $400 billion a year would have regulated only the largest emitters, those emitters that emitted 25,000 tons of CO2 a year. And it would have cost the economy $400 billion. Now, we rejected it, and we all know that's what the cost of it. But because the President owes this environmental base, and he can't pass it in legislation, he's now taking unilaterally regulatory action to regulate greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. Now, keep in mind, This is not one of the bills that was that we had defeated, because that would have only caused the emission control on those entities that emitted 25,000 tons of CO2 or more in a period of a year. But if it's done by regulation, then it has to be done under the Clean Air Act. The significance of this is this would not just go after the big emitters. It wouldn't go after just the big, those who emitted 25,000 tons a year. It would catch people and individuals in organizations that emitted 250 tons. That's 250 tons as opposed to 25,000 tons. That means that would apply not just the large emitters like power plants, but every refinery, oil and gas well, every manufacturing facility, every plastics plant, the iron smelters, steel mills, every apartment building, churches, every school. And so that's everybody. And so one thing that's never been calculated is what the cost of that would be. Because if the cost of just those emitting 25,000 tons would be $400 billion a year, then how much would it be if you apply that to everybody all the way down to 250 tons? You know, I do something in Oklahoma each year. I get the total number of people who file federal tax returns, and I kind of do the math. So I'll take the amount of a tax increase, in this case, let's use $400 billion a year. And I say, how much would this cost? The average family in my state of Oklahoma that files a tax return, and it works out $3,000 a year. So we're talking about a major tax, by far the largest tax increase that this country has ever seen. So don't let the president fool you into believing that he'll stop at the power plants. He is at an all-out war against fossil fuels and affordable energy. And legally, if he goes down this path, he will not be able to stop just at the large ones. This will apply to everybody out there under the Clean Air Act, and that would be those emitting 250 tons. And he's doing it unilaterally just for the United States. If you believe that man is causing global warming, now I don't, but if you believe that, then you should be concerned about worldwide emissions. Because who cares? It's not what's happening just in the United States of America. It's all over the world. That's where the problem, if there's a problem, would be. If all we do is lower our emissions without convincing China and India, Mexico, and other countries to do the same, then the United States manufacturers, out seeking the energy to run their operations, would have to leave the United States and go to those other countries where they don't have regulations. So it had the effect, actually, of increasing, not decreasing, emissions. I remember when Lisa Jackson was the director of the EPA. She was my favorite liberal. I used to identify, I had three favorite liberals. She's one of the three of them. And I liked her because even though I disagreed with her philosophically, she was always honest with me. I'd ask her a question and she'd answer it. And I remember when I asked her the question live on TV in a hearing, I said that, you know, if we were to pass any of this legislation that would regulate CO2 levels, would this reduce would this reduce emissions worldwide? She said no, because this only affects the United States, and it would not affect the other countries. So that's you won't hear the president talking about this. You won't hear him talking about the cost, even though they will shrink from our economy by more than $400 billion a year. We know that. No one refutes that. It required the EPA to hire an additional 230,000 employees and spend an additional $21 billion to implement the regulatory regime. And these are not my figures. These are the EPA's figures. And you won't hear him talking about it because he knows it's a losing argument. In fact, the day before the president gave his speech, he had his campaign send out talking points to all of the activists that he has working in his behalf. They told them exactly, they, being the White House, told these people exactly what to talk about what to say and exactly what not to say. Now, we recovered this. We found that this is the talking points that the president sent out to people, so America would be, this is what they'd be listening to. And I think it's worthwhile for us to go over this right now. On this first chart, you have his overarching three-point strategy. Point number one is we have an obligation to act. The memo continues, we have a moral obligation to future generations to leave them a planet that's not polluted and damaged by carbon pollution. Now, notice they're not talking about climate change anymore, and they're not talking about global warming. The new word that they're using now is carbon pollution. All the same thing, but global warming didn't work, so they discontinued that. They tried climate change, that didn't work. Now the new word, so you'll probably hear it for a while till it's replaced. It's called carbon pollution. Their talking points. This is the president's talking points, and I think this kind of wordsmithing is actually smart. I compliment them on going to professionals and seeing what kind of words they can use to make the public believe something that isn't true. Now, the second thing that they have charged would be that communities all over America are already being harmed. The memo continues, and I'm quoting now from the memo. It says, climate change, this is on the second point up here. Climate change is already harming Americans all over the country. Cleaning up after climate-driven disasters last year cost the average taxpayer over $1,100. Or cost taxpayers nearly $100 billion, one of the largest non-defense discretionary budget items since 2012. Now, these are the words coming from the White House for people to use in their talking points. These figures come from the total cost of all natural disasters. Now, I'm from Oklahoma. I think we all know that we have tornadoes in Oklahoma. And we've had tornadoes as long as I've been, the years I've been living in Oklahoma, all my life. And, of course, that has nothing to do with this. So he's talking about that figure on all natural disasters. That has nothing to do with carbon whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense to attribute every single natural disaster and its total cost to global warming or carbon pollution, as the president now says, even if you believe global warming is true. So the third point, the president's talking points were to the president's climate plan is full. This is what the president is telling his followers in this body and elsewhere to do. So the president's climate plan is full of common sense solutions, including first ever limits on carbon pollution from power plants. The memo continues. That's why we applaud President Obama's, this is what we're supposed to, Obama wants us to say about him. That's why we applaud President Obama's climate plan, which is full of common sense solutions, starting with his call for the EPA to limit the carbon pollution from power plants while we set limits for, and they say further, while we set limits for arsenic, mercury, and lead, we let power plants release as much carbon pollution as they want. It's time to set a limit on pollution that affects public health, and that's why it's so important that the president is rising to this challenge. Those are his talking points he wants people to say about his speech and about his program. Now, what this demonstrates to me is that the president is no longer fighting greenhouse gases, which he says cause global warming, but is instead fighting against carbon pollution. But if carbon pollution is simply carbon dioxide or CO2 and it's dangerous to our health, what are we going to do about the air that we breathe? Don't we emit CO2 every time we exhale? Is this the pollution that they're talking about? Also, in the memo, the president's alarmists are given a concrete list of things to talk about and things not to talk about. This is something that we received just a few hours ago, and we're very pleased to be able to get a copy of it. This was only supposed to go to alarmists. Alarmists, for the benefit of my colleagues, are people who believe the world's coming to an end and it's all man's fault. So it says what to do and what not to do. Just look at this. That's just amazing on what you can say and what you can't say. We'll highlight just a few. The first point is the instruction to not talk about the cost of regulations. The memo says, and you can read it right there, this came from the White House, don't lead with straight economic arguments. Why? Because global warming legislation will cost between $300 and $400 billion a year, and the regulations will cost much, much more than that. Charles Rivers Associates, and I think that's a credible group that no one has challenged, to my knowledge, their credibility since they've been in existence. In their study of the Waxman-Markey bill, reported that the policies would cost the economy $350 billion a year in 2030 and $730 billion a year in 2050. Again, we go back to the figures that's consistent with what the Wharton School 10 years before and MIT came out with. The Heritage Foundation. They said that the average family would see its direct energy costs rise by over $24,000 in the first 20 years following the bill's enactment. Now, this is the Heritage Foundation saying how it's going to affect every family, the average family in America. The cost will be far higher under the President's unilateral regulatory actions that are bypassing Congress because they're talking about regulating down to a much lower emissions level. The memo also instructs, now we're talking about this memo right here that came out to the alarmists to use to support the President. The memo also instructs the President's alarmists to talk about his actions being, quote, the latest in a series of steady and responsible steps the administration has taken, unquote, to combat global warming. In that vein, however, the memo instructs then to not overstate the magnitude of the action being taken. In other words, the President does not want his people talking about this being the first of many steps in regulating every refinery, manufacturer, oil and gas well, steel mill, plastics, and all of this. He doesn't want them to talk about that. The next memo instructs alarmists to, quote, discuss the impacts. Carbon pollution is bad for the health of our kids and our planet, but do not debate the validity of the consensus of the science that has already been settled. Well, in other words, don't debate the science. Just say it's been settled, because we have more and more and more people now questioning the science, and it's far from being settled. So they don't want to bring that up. They don't want people talking about that. Well, the science is far from settled, and since wind is carbon dioxide, which we all breathe on every day, hurt our kids. The memo also instructs alarmists to, and this is a quote from his memo, you're looking at it here, inform audiences about the nature of the problem, who is at fault, and what can be done. But do not, quote, debate the increase in electricity prices. Instead, pivot to health and clean air messages. In other words, don't admit the truth. That is active unilateral regulation will do nothing more than increase electricity prices and unilaterally shut down our economy by imposing EPA regulations on every single industry and dramatically expand the federal government's role in our lives. Now, this is all instructions coming from the White House without doing anything to reduce global emissions. Now, this is why I've got to repeat this at this time. If we do all this stuff, if it were done by legislation or by regulation, we know that it's not, we've already shown clearly, it will not reduce CO2 emissions, even if that were your goal, if you wanted to do it, because that's what the administrator, Obama's administrator of the EPA said. In answer to the question, is this going to reduce CO2 emissions? He said, no, it won't. I've already covered that. And also that this is Richard Lindzen and other scientists have talked about this is the bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. So keep that in mind. You have all this effort is being made, and we've made it very clear that it's not going to accomplish anything that they want to accomplish in terms of reducing CO2 emissions worldwide. The last thing I'll mention from the memo is that it says to, quote, discuss modernizing and retooling power plants and innovation that will create green jobs, but do not, quote, try to suggest net job increases. In other words, don't mention that this is going to shut down every coal, oil, and eventually a natural gas power plant that we have in this country and kill thousands of jobs at manufacturers around the nation. We don't want to talk about the job loss. The President only wants to talk about the benefits of his regulatory actions and not about the costs. But what we have to remember is that even the benefits are false and overstated because they do not rely on the true cost of the regulations. But we should not be surprised, this coming from the administration that thinks that more regulations means more jobs. These are talking points, but the mechanics of these new and future EPA greenhouse gas rules will be done by the EPA. Gina McCarthy right now, and that's the reason I'm here today, is to, first of all, demonstrate the speech that he made and how that relates now to the current EPA and perhaps the confirmation hearing, the confirmation vote that will be coming up. Gina McCarthy is currently being considered to take the top job at the agency. And then, remember, I said that Lisa Jackson had that job before and how much I thought of her. Well, I like Gina. I like her very much. I've worked with her. She has had a different job for several years, and that is she was the assistant director of the EPA for air issues. But that's the reason. It's very important that people understand what we're looking at. We have a good personal relationship, but she's one of the one who's responsible for all of the worst regulations that have come from the EPA in the last 4 years under Lisa Jackson's leadership. Lisa Jackson was director, but Gina McCarthy was the air director. And it's from the Air Office, the Assistant Administration for Air, where she has the most expertise, and that all of the worst regulations will come in the future. After President Obama's speech on global warming, it became clear that Gina McCarthy will be used as the tool of the administration for all these regulations that will destroy the American economy. In the last 4 years, we've had Utility MAC. I've listed these up here. It's really worth looking at. Utility MAC. The MAC means the maximum achievable control technology. That is, what technology is out there to control the emissions. And so a utility MAC would cost and she was able to get that through $100 billion, 1.65 million jobs lost. Next thing they're able to get the boiler MAC, that's $63.3 billion and 800,000 jobs lost. Regional haze, another regulation regulating the air, will increase the cost of Oklahoma's electricity bills by over $1.8 billion. And these are all figures that are incontrovertible. People don't disagree with them. In the next few years, even worse regulations are likely to come out. Greenhouse gas regulations may be the worst, but there's also the others that are being listed here. You have the greenhouse gas, that's one we've been talking about, but you also have the ozone NAAQS regulations. The adjustments to that rule could put 2,800 counties out of attainment, including all of them in Oklahoma. We have 77 counties in my state of Oklahoma. I can remember when I was mayor of Tulsa, they came out with new regulations that put Tulsa County out of attainment. Now, when you're out of attainment, that means you kiss any energy development, new manufacturing opportunity, or any other business expansion goodbye. They won't be able to get a permit from the EPA. Now, Gina McCarthy is in the face of President Obama's over-regulatory agenda that is threatening our energy independence and putting our economic future in peril. We can't allow these regulations to move forward, and I think the key to that is the person who is responsible for all the regulations, all the costs, all the jobs that I just enumerated, both during her tenure as the air boss of EPA, and then these that would come in the future. That would be her goal. She would be the tool that is being used by the administration. And we know that yesterday was kind of interesting because Heather Zeichel, I believe is the way you pronounce her name, she was the one who had Carol Browner's job as the czar. What kind of czar was she?
Climate change.
The climate change czar. And she was on the Hill, huddling in a secret meeting with some of the chief alarmists, like Barbara Boxer and some of the rest. I've got the long list here, but I won't bother. In the meeting, they talked about the president's plan and presumably this memo with wordsmithing talking points from the memo we talked about before. So the one that we had up before is the same thing that they talked about yesterday. This is how you're going to have to word all this stuff. Their goal is not to protect the American people, it is to control them. They want top-down control, and carbon dioxide regulations will give them this to them. And their talking points memo proves that they are doing all they can to craft their message in a way that convinces Americans that they are not trying to crush our economy, but instead trying to help. But the truth is their regulatory agenda will only cause more unemployment, lower economic growth, and lower take-home pay for the American people. You know, President Obama delivered a beautiful speech, global warming. That's how I started this little talk, and it was beautiful. It was well thought out, and he is very gifted. He had a beautiful speech, and he's embarking on the most devastating surge in regulation that will cost hardworking Americans millions of jobs and tax increases. Put the chart up again on the costs there. Do you have that? Yeah, of the tax increases to accomplish nothing. Keep in mind, if you do all these things, it's not going to lower CO2 emissions. We've got that. That is proved. No one has denied it. And that even came from the administrator of the EPA. And it's going to be devastating to the American people. And so this is the big thing. It has a lot to do with the confirmation hearing of the very fine lady that's been a good friend of mine for a long time, but the one who is responsible for these air regulations that is killing jobs in America. And we can't let that happen. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
We can do that because these are complicated programs off the cuff, as we're attempting to do today or in the last several days. It turns out that if we do not extend for at least a year this rate, then the contrary proposals will eventually raise rates on students across the board. And that's because the law calls for now a 6.8% rate for the Stafford subsidized and unsubsidized loans and other specified rates, fixed rates. And in order to score this as a zero in terms of the Congressional Budget Office of deficit effects, we have to, over that time, make up all that interest. So the proponents of the alternate approach are suggesting we will go with a lower rate now, but that simply means mathematically that we'll have to have higher rates in the future. And the question of when that future arrives is a function of the way interest rates will be moving in the overall economy, and every indication is those interest rates will start rising, and perhaps quickly. The Federal Reserve has already indicated that they are beginning to pull back on their quantitative easing, which means rates are likely to go up. We've seen a significant rise in the 10-year T-bill rate just in the last month. It's gone up almost a full percentage point. So you're in a rising rate environment, moving from a fixed rate to a floating rate without a cap, without an effective cap. So what we know is it might not be next year, it might not be the following year, but very relatively quickly, we could likely see and will likely see students paying higher than the 6.8% rate. And without a cap, it could be significantly higher. So if we adopt the proposal that's suggested by my colleagues, and they have been working with great energy and great sincerity to try to come up with a solution, I'm afraid we're going to end up ultimately seeing students paying much, much more. And that's not what we should be about. We have a situation right now, even with the 3.4% that just doubled July 1st, 6.8%, where the federal government is making about $50 billion this year between the cost of funds and the repayments being made by students. So students have become profit centers for the federal government, rather than, as I think the intention of the program, that the federal government is going to help students go ahead and get through college so they could help us as productive workers in our economy. And it's projected that these federal programs between now and 2023, in the 10-year period, will make $184 billion for the federal government in terms of the difference between what students are paying back and the cost of borrowing for the government. And so there's a lot we could do, I think, but not in 24 hours, to redesign our program so that students essentially are not being hammered with huge debts and we are benefiting, profiting from those students. The CBO estimates that under this Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act, students would pay an additional $37.8 billion more in their loans than they would under the current rate of 6.8% between 2017 and 2023. Goes to my initial point. The first few years, it's been designed so that the interest rates will be lower than 6.8. But according to the CBO, between 2017 and 2023, so if you're a high school student right now, you're looking at paying a lot of money if you intend to go to college, about $37.8 billion more, because this all has to balance out to effectively a 6.8% interest rate, which is the current law. Students know that. That's why they've come and said, listen, thanks, but no thanks. This short-run discount of a few years in terms of the interest rate, we know we might be paying it if we're just starting out our college. We definitely know that our younger brothers and sisters in high school and another generation of Americans will. And so I don't think we should take that approach. I think what we've said is, listen, let's wait. You know, we have a lot of work to do. We want to look at proposals that might actually align the real cost of federal borrowing for college education and the real charges that we impose on students. Right now, my sense is that what our colleagues have done in their bipartisan approach has been essentially to make sure that the first few years look really good. They're certainly less than 6.8%, close to 3.4%, but then they have to put in a rather arbitrary delta, an increase in cost, because at the end of the 10-year period, they're going to have to make up all the interest that would have been charged at 6.8%. That's not, I think, the way to approach fundamental reform of college loans in this country. There's another point I think that's important to make, too, is that we have always either had a fixed rate or an adjustable rate with a cap on each loan program. Cap on subsidized Stafford loans, unsubsidized Stafford loans, and on the plus loans for families. Now we don't have a cap. There's some discussion that if you consolidate your loans, you'll get an 8.25% cap. But consolidation can only take place after you're in repayment. And before you're in repayment, all that interest on the unsubsidized Stafford loans and the plus loans are accumulating, and being capitalized in what you owe. And so when you consolidate, you have a much, much bigger principal to pay off. There might be a cap of 8.25%, but it's a much bigger principal. Oh, and by the way, it's extended over a longer period of time. So you also have to pay for that longer extension of time. That's not the cap we've had before in the context of these programs. It's been a cap on the individual loan, a cap on a subsidized loan, a cap on an unsubsidized Stafford loan, a cap on a plus loan. And that's, I think, a major sort of fault within the proposal that we're seeing today. And the other issue, too, and it goes to the index, is that we've chosen a 10-year T-bill interest. Typically, we've chosen the 91-day T-bill interest. And the 91-day T-bill is cheaper, frankly, so that you start off with a much lower index that the student has to pay. And then you add other costs to it, or the discount, the estimate of default, and all those things to come up with the final rate. But we're going to a 10-year T-bill rate, which means that students will be paying more relative to a 91-day Treasury bill rate. And again, I just don't think that that's the way we want to do. We want to take the time to try to address this whole set of issues, to do it in a thoughtful way, to understand that one of the big challenges we have is not just the issue of what rate, it's how do we keep college costs in check? How do we provide the kind of education? How do we deal with the interaction between all of these different types of loans? How do we go ahead and, again, this might be one of the biggest challenges we'll face here going forward, is how do we somehow allow these students who are drowning in debt to effectively refinance these loans so that they can buy homes, they can buy cars, they can participate in the economy. That is not included in this proposal. And indeed, one of my concerns is, if these rates are locked in, and this is long-term in legislation, then we won't have the incentive, the proper incentive to effectively deal with these issues. We'll just let them slide along, and I think that would be to our great detriment, and more importantly, the detriment of families throughout the country. There's been, you know, and appropriately so, comments and criticism of this short-term approach. You know, we should have fixed it last year. Well, we haven't fixed it, and I think we have to give ourselves the time to fix it. There is a suggestion that we're just dealing with a portion of the loans, the subsidized Stafford loans, and that everybody else won't get a benefit. But from the numbers that we've seen from CBO, one thing is certain, that in the last few years, from at least 2017 to 2023, everyone, subsidized, unsubsidized, plus loans, will be paying more. So the one sort of conclusion we can draw, if we go to the alternative approach, is that eventually every borrower will be paying more. And I therefore very strongly would urge that we move forward with this cloture vote to get on to the legislation. As Senator Harkin rightly pointed out, once we're on the legislation, it's open to amendment. At least we can have the proposals from all of my colleagues that could improve or change or modify. But if we don't get to culture, then we're not moving forward. And I think we should at least move forward.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the controlled time be extended until 7 p.m. and that all the provisions of the previous order remain in effect.
Is there objection? So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
So, waiting for senators to come back to the floor to recap what's happened today, the Senate blocked a Democratic proposal aimed at addressing the doubling of student loan interest rates that took effect last week. That bill was sponsored by Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, would have rolled back the student loan interest rate to 3.4% for 1 year to give lawmakers more time to craft a more permanent fix, but that measure not managing to move forward today. We'll watch and wait and see what the Senate has for the rest of this afternoon. Live coverage always right here on C-SPAN 2.
Senator from Ohio.
Thanks, President. I ask unanimous consent to dispense the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the Senate floor from time to time to share thoughts from people in my state, and we all are hearing comments from people, college students, people who have finished college, and often from the parents of those who face these massive kind of debt from going to 2-year, 4-year private public schools, sometimes most tragically at a for-profit school where they haven't gotten much help in job search, and equally, even more tragically, when they've not finished school and still face this debt. My wife, Connie Schultz, graduated from Kent State University some number of years ago. Her father was a utility worker, carried a union card for more than 30 years. Her mother was a home care worker, oldest of 4. First in the family to go to college. All her 2 younger brothers and sisters and brother also went to college. Connie graduated from Kent State University with debt of only $1,200. That was 30-some years ago. That so starkly illustrates the difference between today and then. I mean, she had little privilege, little money, parents that couldn't really put much money out, but with Pell Grants, with lower tuition Pell Grants, few scholarships and Stafford loans, she was able to get through, and working, she was able to get through school with little debt. The stories we hear today are so different from that, and I plead with my colleagues that we freeze interest rates at 3.4%. That won't solve anything close to all the problems of higher college tuition and costs of room and board, but it will help. And we need to do much more than that. I convene every year the 50 or 60 college presidents from Ohio, 2- and 4-year private and public schools, community colleges, private schools, 4-year state universities, all of them to come and discuss these things. We've done it for 6 years in a row. It's helpful to try to find ways to keep higher education costs in check. But again, not nearly enough. But I'm hopeful that in the next 24 hours or so, we can freeze interest rates at 3.4% and then get serious about what we're going to do. What we're going to do about the $1 trillion aggregate debt that college students, that students or former students have in this country, focusing in part on the $150 billion of the trillion that 2.9 million students are burdened with, that is debt from the private market, the $150 billion of the trillion. 15% is in the private market, where interest rates sometimes are as high as 12 or 15 or 16%. And few private banks are willing to renegotiate those loans, to refinance those loans. My legislation with Senator Heitkamp will help us with a carrot and a stick approach, both encourage these private institutions, these banks, the private lenders, to refinance these loans. But let me share a couple of letters from students and families, because I think that speaks volumes better than I can, Mr. President. This is a letter from Daniel from Centerville, Ohio. Daniel has been at the University of Dayton. He said, I currently have $100,000 in outstanding loans. Last summer, I graduated with a master's degree in middle child education. The previous summer, I graduated with a bachelor's as well from Wright State University in Dayton. Starting in July of 2013, my average monthly payment for all my student loans will be $600 a month. I recently got one of my payments lowered, otherwise that total would have been over $800 a month. I've consolidated all I can. I've deferred and still made payments while in deferment, other loans which will be due in February 2014, adding to the $600 a month payment. I teach in a school in Cincinnati, and he writes in capital letters, I love the work that I do. It was impossible to find a job in Dayton, so now I spend $200 a month just traveling to Cincinnati, 40 miles or so one way. In addition, even though I have a part-time job in the summer while school's out, I still find myself struggling to pay. He says the country needs to, he said, I'll be well over 65 years old before I'm able to pay off my college loans. He says the country needs to rethink its priorities. That's Daniel from Centerville, Ohio. Melinda from Canton, Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, writes, after graduating from college, I had roughly $23,000 in student loan debt. My payments are $276 a month. Until I'm in my 30s, I'm very tightly budgeted. While I'm able to make this payment which is my largest and most important bill each month aside from rent, puts me in a vulnerable situation when it comes to emergencies. I recently had to have surgery for a chronic medical problem. I was in an auto accident, had to visit the ER. Making that loan payment every month leaves little extra to be saved for unexpected expenses. I understand it's my responsibility to pay it. I loved every minute of my education, so it was worth it. But at the end of the day, a hike in my interest rates may be the difference between my saving a little money each month or saving nothing. I fall asleep at night knowing that I'm 24 years old and yet to begin saving for a retirement, which will be a very important issue for my generation, and not even getting into the issues of retirement, of Social Security, and the efforts from some of our colleagues here to privatize that system. I won't even go into more detail there. Christy from Ashtabula, the community my wife grew up in, writes, as a low-income individual, I was forced to decide on going to college by a measure of a few things: who could give me the best education, the most financial aid. But there was a catch. I couldn't leave Ohio. I couldn't live far away from home because I didn't have access to a car. And my single-parent mother, who works 2 jobs, would have no way to get me there if there were emergencies. I chose Case Western Reserve University, a renowned university, ranked, she says, at 37th in the country. My financial aid package was hefty. If I'd paid full tuition, $52,000 each year, I'd be in an insane $200,000 debt by graduation. Luckily, by the end, I'll only own a quarter of that, yet that's still $60,000 in debt. That's pretty much a house and a car. And the last letter I'll read is Linda from my hometown of Mansfield, Ohio. I have 2 children currently attending state schools in Cleveland and in Akron. We're a middle-class family working hard to make ends meet and help our children to the best of our ability. Even after saving for them and thinking we had plenty for them to get through without much debt, the market crashed in 2008. More than half our hard-earned college savings for them disappeared. They've had to take out loans in order to be able to attend. We don't have the kind of money for them to borrow from us or to pay the thousands that their college savings doesn't cover. But both of them are on the dean's list every semester. My son's an environmental science major. My daughter minored in Spanish. Her major is exercise physiology and physical therapy. They're bright. They're intelligent. They've worked extremely hard to get where they are. I implore you not to lead them with ridiculous amounts of debt by allowing the interest rate to double. The stories are pretty consistent, Mr. President, that these students are struggling. They already are thinking about buying a house, starting a business, saving for retirement, even though they're in their 20s. They know the challenges are greater in this generation than previous generations. And also what's really obvious in these letters is the impact this has on families, not just the student who's 25 or 22 or 19 or 28, facing this lifelong or these years of paying off student loans, but what it means to the family that maybe takes a second mortgage on their house to help their son or daughter, the family that faces foreclosure because of the financial problems, the family that simply can't help their student, as broken-hearted as that makes a parent. They can't help their son or daughter because of their financial situation, help them with that college education. Mr. President, again, I'm hopeful we can freeze interest rates at 3.4% for 1 year and get serious about what we need to do for access to college and affordable higher education for our young people. Mr. President, I suggest yes in the corner.
Clerk will call the roll.